Come, boy, it's only a film. Come. Pull yourself together. Now, a few dollars, eh? That'll get your head up. Come on, money.
One significant reality of John Lennon's actions: you understand he is among the most well-known historical figures in rock, but not all was a fan. Indeed, some of the most well-known names, and he couldn't tolerate the music, whether it was his vocal advocacy, his artistic decisions, or even purely private betrayals. Lennon was able to sour a few musicians in the incorrect way. I am aware that you've seen such films with When We See Elvis or someone else in it. We're still in Liverpool due of resentment. These 6 artists are competitors in public disputes. Not only did they not like Lennon, they detested him. He and a few others even insured the world Elvis. Let's find out who they are. John Lennon, Elvis Presley, and Presley were among the most significant 20th century musicians, although their sole encounter was anything than cordial. The rock and roll king had a strong aversion to the former Beatles, which merely increased over time. Their political tensions ruined the partnership. Disparities, personal contempt, and even alleged attempts to deport Lennon United States of America. Their notorious The Gathering happened at Presley's in 1965. Residence in Los Angeles. Chris Hutchins, a music journalist. The Beatles were arranged by a publicist to meet the musician Elvis, whom they all adored. However, I admired Lennon from the first. Tension started as they entered Presley's estate. The conflict resulted from their enormously distinct political views. In particular, Lennon was an outspoken critic of the Vietnam War. The pacifists saw right away a series of table lamps with a covered shaped wagons with the message inscribed on each, "All the way with Lyndon B. Johnson." This expression served as a catchphrase for the administration of President Johnson, particularly in light of his combative. Lennon's military posture in Vietnam hated Johnson's squandered war policies, wasted little time in voicing his opposition to the war. Presley was not pleased with this, as he was extremely patriotic and in favor of the U.S. government. Consequently, what might been a momentous occasion between two among the most influential people in rock and pop history became an awkward and unpleasant interaction with Hutchins afterwards. Remember how Presley was clearly displeased with Lennon's vocal pacifism, laying the groundwork for years of anger. The animosity Presley felt for Lennon didn't fade following their first encounter. In fact, it simply intensified the king's contempt. The frontman of the Beatles was further motivated by his belief that the band had negatively impacted America's young people. By in 1971, his distaste had grown to the point that he asked Jay for help. Edgar Hoover, the strongman and the FBI's controversial director. Presley voiced worries that Lennon, as well as the Beatles' contribution to moral deterioration among youths due to their dirty, disheveled looks and obscene music. He also allegedly claimed that they had laid the foundation for drug culture, young rebellion, and Presley's anti-government stance. Hoover's meeting at the FBI. There was more to headquarters than a casual conversation. It was a sincere attempt to convince the organization to act. Opposing Lennon. Although Lennon was having problems with immigration as he and his Yoko Ono's wife was looking for a permanent U.S. residency, his opposition to war activity, especially his resistance to the administration of President Richard Nixon, had previously designated him as a target for government monitoring. Presley's support for these issues probably contributed to the rise in federal pressure on Lennon authorities. Bob Dylan, and Bob Dylan. Lennon's connection was complex. One based on influence and admiration and eventually, competition. In the early years of Lennon was enthralled with the Beatles because Dylan's lyrical, reflective lyric style. Dylan's capacity to create intricate, individually poignant lyrics signaled a sharp as opposed to the catchy surface-level love tunes that were the most popular. The Beatles' early catalog was influenced by Dylan's method of sharing stories. Lennon started adding more introspective and incorporating personal poetry into his own writing, leading to some of his most cherished songs such as In My Life and You Must Keep Your Love Hidden. Although Lennon, however, was greatly impacted by Dylan, the praise wasn't totally mutual. Dylan is renowned for his disobedient enthusiasm and witty humor weren't especially admired. The notion that Lennon had copied. He observed Lennon's manner change as a slightly derivative, and rather than taking it as a compliment, he saw it as a copy of what Dylan had already strengthened his reputation as a countercultural icon by the middle of the 1960s, but he wasn't interested in being in the same room as the Beatles, who, in spite of their growing artistic pop superstars, were still viewed as having depth. Instead of ground by's underground poets in 1965, their conflict escalated to more noticeable when the Beatles issued It was evident that Dylan's rubber soul influence was a major factor in the record. This bird's flight over Norwegian forests was a sad story that stands out in particular of treachery and love that demonstrated Lennon's increasing curiosity about folk-inspired narratives. The acoustic version of the song Nature that was driven by stories felt extremely similar to what Dylan might have written himself, and it seems that Dylan did not get along with him in 1966. Provided a harsh reply in the rendition of the song, Fourth Time Around, from Blonde on Blonde, his iconic album. The song was a thinly veiled spoof of Norwegian Wood mimicking its tune framework and poetical ideas, but with a Dylan's tone was sarcastic and almost contemptuous. The lyrics depicted a strange, distant dialogue between two individuals with an underlying tone of bitterness and sarcasm. The two songs' commonalities were too planned to be unintentional. Indicating that Dylan was sending a message, sent Lennon a direct message to drive. The Dylan didn't merely release the message home. According to reports, he performed the song for Lennon live. The occasion must have been extremely uneasy for Lennon, who in spite of his own acerbic tongue, the Dylan's poetic parody of Lennon's Target was said to have been alarmed by the feel uncertain about whether the music was intended as a direct insult or humor. Although he never specifically acknowledged his sentiments regarding the fourth time around some. According to reports, he quit the feel shocked upon discovering that his appreciation for Dylan was not completely returned. Early in the 1970s, Steely Dan Imagine by John Lennon became one of the most famous and contentious songs of its time, widely praised as an anthem for peace and solidarity. It also attracted strong critiques from viewers of its utopian idea as foolish, unrealistic, or among the critics who were even hypocritical were Dan. The sharp-tongued steely rock duet with jazz influences, Donald Fagen and Walter Becker, is well known for his pessimistic, almost satirical songwriting style. Dan Steely targeted Lennon's Only an Idiot with Idealism would claim that a song from their debut album in 1972, Unable to Purchase a Thrill. At the core of Dan Steely's criticism was the conviction that Lennon's global peace crusade was not only impractical, but also disengaged from the daily challenges individuals. But Lennon portrayed himself as a trailblazing individual demanding a religion or a borderless world. Steely Dan's material prosperity was a inconsistency between his message and his way of life. Lennon's demands for an ideal society seemed empty when, from a man who was a resident of a lavish home, performed a magnificent Steinway piano and relished the benefits of Only an Idiot, would claim that rock stars are wealthy. It's brimming with irony. With its relaxed groove and surprisingly light wind, the melody conceals the scathing cynicism below. The lyrics imply that only someone who is detached from reality, living in an affluent and comfortable world, could afford to think about the type of. Lennon's ambition was to sell. Donald Fagen's A Fluid Delivery supports the notion that what Lennon envisioned was merely a imagined something that could sound attractive yet would fall apart in the face of the actual world. Steely Dan's complexity was not, though, the few artists to oppose Lennon's love and tranquility. Frank Zappa is another vocal philosopher. The era's leading personality was equally doubtful regarding Lennon's methodology. Zappa is renowned for his sardonic humor and astute social. Lennon's involvement was viewed in comments as using performance as a means of staying relevant instead of a sincere attempt to implement shift. When Lennon and Zappa were momentarily worked together on stage in 1971, it became clear that different worldviews. Zappa, an ardent individualist, was cautious about phrases and actions that appeared to oversimplify problems in society. His distrust of heroes from the counterculture reached out to Lennon, whom he considered an artist whose work did not necessarily according to his own rhetoric. Lennon was accustomed to receiving such criticism. Even Imagine became one of his defining characteristics works, recognizing their inconsistencies. He acknowledged in interviews that the message of the song was aspirational rather than being indicative of his own way of living. It's possible that Yoko Ono employed their stage to encourage peace, but they still lived in comfort, surrounded by the signs of success, which Lennon subsequently considered his part in the counterculture, acknowledging his fondness for all the others were flawed and struggling. Todd Rundgren worked things out as he went. Todd Rundgren was in the early 1970s. Soaring on a musical success wave with a series of songs that turned into key elements of the pop culture of the time as well as progressive rock songs about landscapes, such as, "Hello It's Me and I Saw the Light" proved his mettle. To create catchy tunes and elaborate arrangements that earned him a renown as a pop artist and studio was visionary, but even if his lyrics were obvious inspirations, especially from the Beatles' its more adventurous latter work, John didn't get a lot of showers from Rundgren. Lennon with respect. In reality, he was outspoken criticism of Lennon's post-Beatles career, particularly his involvement in public advocacy, the language of revolution, as the former Beatles started a solo career. Lennon's compositions become more reflective and political shift with records such as Imagine and the Plastic Ono Band from 1970-1971, which reflected both individual hardships and more general social concerns. Songs like Hero of the Working Class and Tell Me the Truth. Lennon was positioned as a spokesperson for the counterculture, but his relationship Yoko Ono's presence further boosted his change into a world peace advocate, but not everyone shared this opinion. In all honesty, Todd Rundgren is one of Rundgren witnessed Lennon's political being vocal as a selfish endeavor instead of a sincere request for reform. In a Melody Maker interview from 1974, he rejected the activism of Lennon, implying that the former insect showed less enthusiasm in changing things and more worried about maintaining the focus on himself. What he truly desires is to obtain. "I want attention for myself," Rundgren said. And if he gains that through revolution he's going to attract attention by revolution. Lennon was portrayed by these scathing remarks as a publicity seeker instead of an actual revolutionary, suggesting that his tranquility, social positions and campaigns were only a component of a bigger act. Of course, Lennon rejected Rundgren's critique. Little known for his witty remarks and uncensored viewpoints, he responded with a reaction that was both protective and contemptuous to Rundgren. Lennon, in an open letter, rejected the notion that he stood for anything besides his own opinions. "I don't speak for," but he retorted, "it sounds like I symbolized something to you or you wouldn't treat me with such violence." Reaction not only retaliated against Rundgren's charges, but additionally proposed that what he said was more indicative of personal animosity rather than impartial criticism. The conflict between Lennon and Rundgren was more than merely a verbal duel, it revealed a wider rift in the music world about the part that artists play in political conversation. However other people prefer. According to Lennon, musicians had an obligation to utilize their platform for advocacy. Others, like as Rundgren, were doubtful of such initiatives, in particular when they originated from well-known and significant as the former Beatles' Joni Mitchell. Frontman Joni Mitchell. Among the most notable were John Lennon and prominent singer-songwriters of their day. Each period is changing the terrain of Mitchell and her in their own unique style of music. Lyrical lyricism and profound introspection turned into a folk hero, and Lennon as a being a solitary artist and a Beatle was a defining voice of an entire generation. But in spite of their mutual standing as pioneers in music, the two were not in agreement. Interactions were characterized by stress and an underlying conflict that arose between one that was partly inspired by Lennon's unasked-for critique of Mitchell's music. By Joni Mitchell in the early 1970s had made a name for herself among the rock and folk music's most unique vocals, using records such as Ladies of the Canyon Blue 1971 and 1970. She reinterpreted what singer-songwriters were able to accomplish, weaving intimate and intensely moving narrative within her songs. Her compositions for Blue were really innovative, providing an unguarded examination of personal heartbreak, development and the unadulterated complexity of love and loss. It was an unprecedented record that has arrived prior to affecting numerous artists from various generations: Taylor, Lana Del Rey, and Prince. Conversely, Swift. Lennon had adopted an other route after the Beatles. By the when Blue was set free, he had previously released Imagine and Plastic Ono Band in 1970. Both of which demonstrated his personal type of self-examination that was frequently frank and combative, although infrequently as delicate in its poetry as Mitchell's. Despite the fact that both artists were extremely, they approached their music with a personal touch. Various approaches to songwriting. Mitchell's songs frequently developed like complex stories that are rich in vivid imagery and complicated feelings, but Lennon's writing, especially when he was alone, was frequently more straightforward and catchy. Individuals and creative ideologies were destined to conflict, and when they encounter one another, their perceptions of one another were not particularly flattering. The root of their conflict can be found in the instance in which Lennon proposed Mitchell some uninvited comments on her music she didn't ask for advice or valued, although the details of his Mitchell's critique is still ambiguous. Disliked Lennon's condescension considering his past frank and occasionally combative in his thoughts, it's probable that his comments was not very tactful. Mitchell is renowned for her self-reliance, and a person with creative integrity didn't take criticism, particularly from someone who didn't, in her opinion, completely comprehend her musical philosophy. Lennon's contemptuous treatment of folk. The artist had a well-documented background. Occasionally had scant tolerance for the singer's introspective nature. Songwriter's propensity for speaking up, even cutting, could have more increased the hostility between them. Later, Mitchell shared her own annoyances with Lennon, and in an uncommon example of her public criticism, she didn't keep him in the greatest respect, although many in the music Lennon was revered by the world, and she saw past the mythology and discovered his flaws, possibly even somewhat hypocritical according to her. His public service and activism personality didn't always match his behaviors, and she didn't hesitate to express that viewpoint. John Lennon and Frank Zappa were both innovative musicians, yet a brief partnership in 1971 came to an end in dispute as well as disappointment, which Zappa is renowned for cutting-edge method of rock, and his keen, straightforward personality was harsh criticism of Lennon, not because of his music, but for what he perceived as a brazen stealing, which caused them to fall out. From one performance night at the where Lennon and Yoko Ono lived in Fillmore East accompanied Zappa and the mothers of an idea for a spontaneous jam session. What ought to have been a special and fascinating intersection of two legendary artists instead become a resentful disagreement about ownership and credit. The performance was held on June 6, 1971. While Zappa was performing at the Lennon's Fillmore East in New York City, who was experimenting with different musical styles following Imagine's new friendship with admired Zappa's experimental search for something new and unorthodox, Lennon and Ono adopted the Zappa and his band joining the stage them at an unstructured jam session that contained a number of items, one of which was King Kong is a reputable Zappa, the piece he had been performing since the late 1960s. Everything seemed to be amiable enough. The jam was a lively, unplanned experiment that combined Zappa's complex configurations of instruments with Ono and Lennon's spontaneous. Lennon's vocalizations were especially attracted to the most chaotic, almost ridiculous characteristics of the performance that matched his post-Beatle fascination with exploring the boundaries of music. But the goodwill was short-lived when Lennon released in New York City. At some point in the live recording from that evening in 1972 was included on the Problem album. Jam Rag was the new name for the song King Kong. And Zappa's writing was not acknowledged. Rather, the song was given credit to Ono and Lennon, giving the impression that it was a piece of original music they wrote for Zappa. This wasn't merely a mistake. Zappa didn't conceal his larceny. Annoyance while talking about the problem in subsequent interviews, he clarified that he believed that Lennon had used him